Hello, welcome back to How to Read a Poem. What does heaven mean? How do we represent heaven? Is heaven a place of complete joy, complete perfection, angels flying around? Or is it something else? Today I'm going to do a poem which is deceptively simple but which unravels itself to be something much, much more. It's called Seascape by the great American poet Elizabeth Bishop. Bishop shares an affinity with Robert Frost in that both start with naturalistic observations of the natural world, of the environment, but they both use the natural environment as a platform to delve into more metaphysical, into more universal themes. So nature becomes a backdrop for existential, metaphysical, grand dramas being played out, and our sense of the human being in relation to these grander themes. So let's start. This celestial seascape with white herons got up as angels, throng as high as they want and as far as they want, sideways in tiers and tiers of immaculate reflections. So we might talk about who is the perspective being told from whose point of view is this seascape being represented. It starts by a very idyllic description of the seascape, but even more than that, it puts religious language onto the natural environment. This celestial seascape with white herons got up as angels. So the metaphorical comparison is between the white birds and angels. So if we were to understand our idea of heaven, the observer is reading the seascape in front of him or her as a sort of representation of heaven, perfection. We get celestial seascape, we get angels all around us. They throng as high as they want and as far as they want, sideways in tiers and tiers of immaculate reflections. So we might talk about this idea of tiers of tiers. In other words, layers upon layers of white, perfect, pristine, immaculate reflection. So the sea mirrors the sky, the birds flying mirror themselves. So it's sort of snapshot of timelessness, a sort of snapshot of eternity. That is, we might say, most people's understanding of what heaven is. Right? When we get to heaven, we escape the cruel passage of time. There we might think we might live forever and ever and ever. So this idea of eternity is represented in the flying of the herons and this idea of the tiers and tiers and tiers and the layers that reflect each other. So the whole region, from the highest heron down to the weightless mangrove island, which bright green leaves edged neatly with bird droppings like illumination silver, and down to the suggestively gothic arches of the mangrove roots and the beautiful pea green back pasture where occasionally a fish jumps like a wildflower. The breathless nature of the lines, the continued use of enjambment suggests the observer's excitement at the depiction of the landscape. Enjambment, which means the run-on lines which continue onto each other, suggesting a sort of breathless excitement in the appreciation of the landscape. Everything's neat, everything's beautiful, everything's idyllic. Even the bird droppings, even those representations of ugliness, they are edged neatly with bright green leaves. So it seems ugliness is contained. It seems everything contributes to the peaceful, to the idyllic nature of what the observer sees in front of him or her. Where occasionally a fish jumps like a wildflower in an ornamental spray of spray, this cartoon by Raphael for a tapestry for a pope, it does look like heaven. So the poem so far stops there. It gives you one whole chunk about the observer's view of heaven. And we might see a sort of artifice to it. We might see words that towards the end suggest a sort of artistic representation. We get ornamental, words that suggest, of course, an ornament, a thing that's designed, a thing that's shaped. Even we get the mangrove roots that are represented to be almost like Gothic arches. So it is an unruly nature. It is nature that has sort of been disciplined in an artistic way. We get this cartoon by Raphael. Of course, Raphael, the Renaissance artist. So Raphael, in other words, might have painted the scene. Raphael might have artistically sculpted the scene in front of us for tapestry for a pope. So with the word cartoon, there's something simplistic being introduced here. It's sort of the idea that almost this scene in front of us is something childlike, is something that's simplistically represented. It's distance from us through the lens of art, through the lens of representation. It does look like heaven. The poem stops there in its first chunk. Now look what happens in the second chunk. But a skeletal lighthouse standing there in black and white clerical dress. Something in the landscape is being personified. But it's being personified in a completely contrasting way to the perfect, to the serene, to the beautiful, to the misty, to the idyllic depiction of the seascape. It is a skeletal lighthouse. It is gaunt. It is skeletal. It is personified like a priest in black and white clerical dress who lives on his nerves. We might think of the lighthouse being very much aware of the turbulence of nature. Of course, the lighthouse's function is to guide ships from the turbulent waters into safe harbors. So the lighthouse might certainly live on his nerves, might be aware to every minute change in the weather. So this personified lighthouse thinks he knows better. Implication could be that he thinks he knows better than the observer in the first part of the poem. So what does he think he knows better? He thinks that hell rages below his iron feet, and that is why the shallow water is so warm. In complete contrast to the calm, to the peaceful waters in the first part of the poem, because the lighthouse is in the landscape, the lighthouse knows that nature in reality isn't peaceful, in reality isn't perfect. He is in the landscape. So we might say this poem opens up a contrast between participation, the lighthouse is in the landscape, and therefore immersion into a reality that is more complex, that is darker than an outsider's representation of it, versus a distance perspective in the first part of the poem. Of course, the speaker doesn't live in the sea, literally. The speaker, we might think, observes what it's like on a peaceful day, but the personified lighthouse knows better. So the personified lighthouse understands that below his feet is hell, because the lighthouse understands that the sea rages, that nature isn't peaceful, nature isn't calm, nature is turbulence. So his job, his mission in life is, we might say, to shine that beam of light and to guide the ships home through the turbulence of sea, which may become now a metaphor for the turbulence of life. So the lighthouse knows that heaven is not like this. Heaven is not like the perfect paradisial understanding that the first part of the poem gives. Heaven is not like flying or swimming, but has something to do with blackness and a strong glare. Now, in the lighthouse's understanding, therefore, his idea of heaven becomes more elemental, becomes more stripped down, becomes more Old Testament-like in terms of this understanding of the wrath, the rage of God. This part of the poem plays with our contrast between light and dark. So we might say, why does the lighthouse understand that heaven has something to do with a strong glare? We might think of the glare in terms of light, and we might think of the lighthouse's function as shining a light in the darkness to guide the people on board the turbulent waters of life to safe harbor. So in the lighthouse's understanding of larger matters, of religion, of life and death, he has a more stark, he has a more, we might say, fundamentalistic understanding of religion. For him, religion can be reduced down to blackness and a strong glare, dark and light, evil and good. And when it gets dark, he will remember something strongly worded to say on the subject. And when it gets dark, he will remember that he needs to say something. We might think of this in terms of, again, when it gets dark, he will once again shine the light as a kind of almost silent preaching about what he thinks to be the fundamental truths of religion. So in this poem, we might say Bishop opens up a contrast between two different representations, two different understandings of the world, two different understandings of what religion is, what religion should be, and what heaven and hell might be like. So it's a matter of perspective the poem wants to urge us to consider. Firstly, do we think of heaven as idyllic? Do we want, of course, to recapture our understanding of the Garden of Eden, which is a dominant theme in literature throughout the ages, throughout the centuries, stretching back to much of Renaissance poetry? We have lost our innocence, and so therefore we need to recapture it. But we can't approach it directly. We need to approach it through art. We need to approach it through writing. We need to approach it through representation. So that simplistic, that naive yearning for a perfection, for an idyllic heaven, that is contained in the first half of the poem. But it transits, therefore, into a different sort of view, an almost polarized view of the opposite. Is heaven starker than this? Is heaven more minimalistic than this? Is heaven more stripped down than this? Have we forgotten the fundamental hard truths of religion in our cozy and idyllic understanding of it? But of course, seeing as this is a well-balanced poem, Bishop suggests that there might be something unwholesome, that there might be something to dour about the lighthouse's understanding of heaven. So it depends on your view, it depends on your perspective. Bishop's naturalistic descriptions open up these sorts of more metaphysical, more religious questions for us to consider. So what is your idea of heaven? So what is your idea of religion? This has been How to Read a Poem. Thank you.